들어오셔서 자리에 착석해 주시면 감사드리겠습니다. Once again, please check out the translator device. Channel 1 for Korean, 2 for English, 3 for Japanese, 4 for Russian, 5 for Spanish. 다시 한번 통역 수신기 채널 확인해 주시기 바라겠습니다. 1번은 한국어, 2번은 영어, 3번은 중국어, 4번은 러시아어, 5번은 스페인어 사용하시면 되겠습니다. 모두 자리에 착석해 주시면 감사드리겠습니다. Please be seated. Thank you. 감사합니다. So now I believe that you get some energies to have the plenary session 4. And before we start, I'd like to kindly ask you to draw up the questionnaire and leave it on your table as you leave for the great growth and also more well-organized Seoul Defense Dialogue next year. And from now on, we'll start the plenary session 4 on the theme of national strategy and crisis management in the cyberspace. So the moderator, Klon Kitchen, Senior Research Fellow, Heritage Foundation, United States of America, will preside over the plenary session 4. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him. I'd like to hand over the microphone. So we are going to fix it. 저희 마이크 한 번만 봐주실 수 있을까요? Once again, would you please press up the button?
Hello. There we go. Well, good morning. New technologies are shaping our nations as well as the international order. The tension between the promise of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other emerging capabilities, and the challenges that these same capabilities provoke, will be a defining feature of geopolitics for the foreseeable future. Specifically, the challenge of cybersecurity. We now live in a world where securing nations means securing networks, but we are innovating faster than we can secure. Even more, there is a growing division between the technology capabilities and the interests of nations like the United States and of China, and those of much of the rest of the world. This cyber gap constrains the development of international norms and frameworks precisely at a time where cyber-enabled statecraft is becoming more frequent and aggressive. And so this leaves us with questions. What norms and frameworks should we pursue in the digital domain, and how do we account for this cyber gap? What role does the private sector play as both enablers and as actors in the cyber domain? And what are the key capabilities and functions nations must have if they want to thrive in this environment? Well, friends, it is my pleasure to say that we have an excellent panel to address these and many other questions related to this important topic. I ask that you allow me to introduce each of them and then join me at the end in welcoming all of them together. Immediately to my left is Professor Byoung-Won, who is a respected professor at Ewha Women's University here in the Republic of Korea. Immediately to his left is Professor Ottis, who is also a respected professor at Estonia's Tallinn University of Technology. Proceeding down the line is Mr. Tomasz Zdzikot, who serves as Secretary of State within Poland's Ministry of National Defense. Pawel Herczynski is the Managing Director for Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response for the European External Action Service. And finally, but certainly not least, is First Assistant Secretary Celia Perkins, who operates as the First Assistant Secretary of Strategic Policy within Australia's Department of Defense. Please join me in welcoming these experts. Like the other panels, we will proceed by beginning with a series of opening remarks from each of our panel. We will then transition to a conversation amongst the panel, and then we will have an opportunity for the audience to submit questions via written questions to the staff here, who will then make those available to me. So as you engage, please feel free to write those questions down and provide them to the staff. Min?
Thank you, Dr. Kitchen. For our discussions, let me say 2 points. The first one is the political aspect of cybersecurity. And every country have had interested in increasing their capability of cyber attack and cyber defense and cyber deterrence. So the imperative of technological superiority in this field has been so high. But I am wondering about the real relevance of those problems. The thing I am worrying about is the stampede for every country toward controlling cyberspaces. So we have witnessed more resources, more attention has been poured into the field of cyberspace, which has been called the process of politicization or securitization. So in every country's domestic politics, we have witnessed so much attention has been poured into the field of cybersecurity. So we have to discuss two things from the everyday crimes in the cyber areas and the really important national security affairs, national security agendas. So that we have to be ready to distribute our resources very efficiently for our next generation. The second thing is the very, very asymmetric nature of the cybersecurity capabilities across countries. We all know there is a need for cooperation in regulating the cyberspaces, but the technology gap, as the moderator said, has been much more big between the technology equipped countries and other developing countries. So we have to find a way to overcome those gap in the technologies. Yeah, let me discuss in detail with after other discussers.
Please.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in Korea again. The weather is slightly less than average in my own personal experience, but it is interesting. So if I look at this panel, it is interesting because where most of them on this panel are people who make policy or execute policy, I am kind of the one that is off. I'm the one who gets paid for playing games, and more specifically, much of my work revolves around cybersecurity exercises, which is just a more serious form of games. I've been fortunate enough to be among the organizers of many exercises around Europe. I've been able to observe the cyber conflict exercise here in Korea, and it has always been an eye-opening experience to see how different nations do things, how the participants of exercises solve the problems that are put in front of them. And this is really why I'm on this panel. We're talking about strategy here, but how do you know your strategy works? It's one thing to write it down on paper, in eloquent language, to announce it to the press. But when the push comes to shove, will it actually work? Now, you could go the high-risk way and just wait for something to happen and then test it live. But I would say, perhaps play a game. Set up an exercise, throw some scenarios at your strategy, at the people who are supposed to execute this strategy, and see where does it fail. And this is really the main point of exercises, not to find the areas that are successful, because they would have worked in a real crisis as well, but to find the areas where your strategy fails. And I know that failure is a slightly different concept here in the East than it is in the West. The concept of saving face, for example. I come from the more Western culture where failure is not perhaps the worst thing that can happen to you. And in exercises, you actually hope to find some things that fail, because then you know that you can improve the existing strategy. So exercises to stress test the things that you have written down very eloquently on paper are almost a must if you want them to actually make sense. And just a few examples of the things you might find in an exercise in a safe setting to fail. Quite often you have conflicts built into your strategy. Your strategy might assume that on the one hand, information flow will be very restricted. There will be security clearances, everything will be confidential. Secure networks will be used to exchange information. And on the same page, you have the assumption that everything has to happen very quickly. And these two things do not really work well together in a real world setting. Because as soon as you put a stamp on a piece of paper, it becomes slow. You cannot share this information. This information gets stopped. And depending on which aspect of this strategy you actually plan to implement, only half of it will succeed. And unfortunately, let's say the confidentiality aspect would succeed. That means that information wasn't shared, which means that most likely you're going to lose this scenario, because information sharing is crucial in solving cyber incidents. So these kinds of assumptions that are built into our strategies are very important, and it makes sense to find out where the weak points are in these assumptions. Now, they don't have to be, let's say, fundamental problems like the one I illustrated with. It could be just a simple aspect of, are the people who are supposed to execute the strategy aware of their responsibilities and rights? Do you have enough resources to go around? Do your partners know what to expect from you and what you expect from them? These are the things that hopefully will cause some spectacular failures during exercises, so that you can fix those aspects for the time when the real problems hit. And with that, I might pass the floor to the next speaker.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me start by saying that it is my second time at the SDD, and how much do I appreciate that year by year the agenda is broader and including hybrid threats such as cybersecurity. It is crucial to discuss those emerging threats in an international environment. It is the only way to build confidence. So once again, thank you to the organizers for growing concept of cybersecurity dialogue during the SDD, starting from the cyber working group just before the SDD on Wednesday this week. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start from a quote. More than 20 years ago, in 1998, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the American CIA, George Tenet, said that we are basing our future on the resources that we have not learned to protect yet. And since then, many things have changed, but I guess that we haven't learned to protect all our resources yet. And it was a question asked also during the cyber working group on Wednesday by a representative from National Defense University in Washington, who asked how do we feel with the concept of connecting more and more items to the global internet, being aware that it is not a safe environment. Now we are connecting cars to the internet. Now the experts say that within the next couple of years, 2-3 years, there is going to be 50 billion of items all across the world permanently connected to the internet. So the concept of Internet of Things is growing. And I'm pretty confident that we can all agree that we are not able to protect all the items in all the environments, in all the countries, in all the networks. But we are still connecting them to the internet. Now the concept of automotive cars, for example, and its influence, its impact on our personal safety and the safety of our nations, that as Ministry of Defense we are aimed to put on the first place. Of course, for the ministries of defense, especially for the NATO members, including Poland, cyberspace since 2014, and for sure since 2016, since the Warsaw Summit, is the operational domain. So it demands the action from the armed forces, from the ministries of defense. It has to be involved in planning. We have to build structures. In 2018, the NATO decided to change its command structures and build a cyber operations center in Mons in Belgium. We are participating in that project, but if we try to point out a word that mostly common defines, we are trying to define what we shall do with cybersecurity globally, internationally, and nationally, the word would be cooperation. And so we talk a lot about cooperation between public and private sector, between states and nations, in many ways. Of course, between civilian and military sector. It is obvious, it is crucial. For example, talking about public-private cooperation, we have to deal with the situation that as an example, the NATO supply and logistics bases in 90% on private companies, such as, of course, critical infrastructures that is in the hands of private companies. So it is obvious, it is crucial to cooperate, but it is the not only word that we should define the cybersecurity. I guess that without scratching out of the board the cooperation, we should underline also the responsibility, which is on many levels. Because first of all, cybersecurity is a horizontal task, so no one will come and do the cybersecurity for you. There is no possibility that you can point out that it is a case of IT guys in your organization, in your company, in your office, but mostly common. It is said by the employees that it is not my issue. It is an issue of the IT guys, of the security department, of the cybersecurity department. No, it is not. It is also your case. It is also your task, and the same applies to the states. The same applies to the sectors within the states. So we have to divide the spheres of responsibility, and we have to be aware that we are responsible for a number of things. The military is responsible, and the ministries of defense, of course, we are responsible for building capabilities, strengthening, developing capabilities of the armed forces to operate in the cyber domain. But together with that comes, for example, the cyber crimes. In 20 most industrialized countries in the world, last year over a billion person suffered from cyber crimes in many ways, identity theft, frauds of many kinds, and so on. Besides of that, we have, of course, the critical infrastructure, the governmental networks. We have to divide responsibility and be aware that it is a task of our own, and no one will come and do this instead of us. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, and thank you for having such a diverse panel. Let me add a few words from a slightly different perspective, as I'm representing an international organization. So let me focus on multilateral context of cybersecurity. I think that all of us agree that cyberspace, and in particular the global, open and interoperable internet, has become one of the backbones of our societies. On the side of the European Union, we underline the importance of a global, open, stable and secure cyberspace, where human rights and fundamental freedoms and the rule of law fully apply. As such, cyberspace supports societal well-being, sustainable and inclusive economic growth and prosperity. European Union and our member states reiterate our concerns about the malicious use of information and communication technologies, ICTs, both by non-state actors and, unfortunately, increasingly also by state actors. Misusing ICTs for malicious purposes affects the entire global community, our governments, our businesses, our citizens, and also, to the growing extent, our armed forces. Unfortunately, the scope and severity of such incidents appear only to be increasing, as are the costs associated with them. We are concerned that these incidents could lead to destabilizing and cascading effects, threatening international peace and international security. In this light, we see the increased attention devoted to cyber issues at the United Nations as an opportunity to further build on the work over recent years to advance peace and stability in cyberspace. We should strengthen common understanding and support for further implementation of the norms, rules, and principles as endorsed by the General Assembly on multiple occasions. We are committed to working within both the newly established open-ended working group and the newly established group of governmental experts to advance cyber stability and welcome close coordination between the two bodies. The European Union underlines our full support to the strategic framework for conflict prevention, cooperation, and stability in cyberspace, as endorsed by General Assembly. The framework is based on the application of existing international law and, in particular, of the UN Charter in its entirety, complemented by the development and implementation of universal norms of responsible state behavior, regional confidence building measures between states, and supported by capacity building efforts. The strategic framework reminds us that despite many challenges associated with ICTs, cyberspace is not a lawless domain. It's not a Wild West. The rule of law fully applies to cyberspace, and denying this may encourage miscalculation, erode accountability for actions, and in result contribute to increased instability in cyberspace. These norms that exist to guide the behavior of states in cyberspace reflect an agreed consensus and shared expectations of the international community. These norms set standards for responsible state behavior and allow the international community to assess the activities and intentions of states in order to prevent conflict and increase stability and security. One of the key opportunities before us now is to build on this work to advance peace and stability in cyberspace. By doing so, we firmly believe that we will not only allow our societies and economies to benefit from open, free, secure, peaceful, and accessible ICT environment, but we will also advance peace and stability in cyberspace. Their cooperation through effective multilateralism remains the best way to advance national as well as collective interests. We strongly support an effective multilateral system underpinned by a rules-based international order which delivers results in tackling present and future global challenges in cyberspace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to our hosts. It is a great honour to be here at the Seoul Defence Dialogue. I will make some brief comments focusing on the Australian government approach to cybersecurity as a national strategy. And I can be even briefer. One of the benefits of being the final speaker is many of the points I wish to make have been made by my panel colleagues. All nations share the benefits and opportunities of digital transformation, and we also all share the risks. I liked Klon's term, cyber-enabled statecraft. I think that's a great way to think about it. But when we think about cybersecurity and a national strategy to deal with the cyber domain, we do it in an environment where we have much evidence of criminal, state-based and state-supported activity through the cyber domain. The wholesale theft of data, intellectual property, disruption to business and government services, interference in political processes and so on. Australia sees cyber threats clearly as a national security threat, and we take the position that a secure cyber domain is crucial to trust and confidence in the digital age for citizens, for governments and for militaries. In Australia, we sought in 2016 to develop a cybersecurity strategy to integrate a national approach to cyber threats. And our 2016 cyber strategy reflects the Australian government philosophy that the dual challenge of the digital age is to both advance and to protect our national interests in this new domain. There are 5 key themes in our cyber strategy: to build a national cyber partnership, to build strong cyber defences, to champion global responsibility through developing cyber norms, to foster growth and innovation, and to build a cyber-smart nation. I'd like to focus briefly on 2 of those themes: cyber defences and global cyber responsibilities and norms. Our cyber defence strategy is designed to build resilience, knowledge and capacity across Australia in government, business and for our citizens. It responds very much to some points made earlier by my colleague from Poland, that people at the core are the key to your cyber defences. It includes technical controls and public initiatives to provide government advice and support to business, to citizens and across our government infrastructure on cybersecurity. It includes standards. The most well referred to in Australia are from our Australian Signals Directorate, an intelligence agency, who have long publicly published advice and support on cybersecurity and information security. Our ASD Essential 8 is a tremendous risk-based approach to securing networks, originally in government, but now something we share across Australia. In our most recent election campaign, our Prime Minister made a funded commitment for what we're calling a cyber uplift across all government systems, and we're working on cyber resilience of critical infrastructure. To my colleague Rain's point, in 2018 we developed cyber incident management arrangements which we exercise regularly to serve as a response to a national cyber event, to understand how we would work across government and at all tiers of state and federal government and with the community in the event of a major cyber incident, and by regularly exercising to understand where accountabilities lie and how capable we are of responding and repairing in the event of a cyber event. And we have much experience in Australia of malicious cyber activity, from an extreme denial of service attack on our last national census to attacks on the systems of our parliament and so forth. And as we consider our national strategy and our approach to cyber in our national security posture, we're highly alert to cyber as a tool of statecraft, of foreign interference, and of grey zone activities that can't be addressed through traditional security responses. So turning briefly to global cyber norms, Australia, of course, supports an open, free, secure internet with international norms and standards. We've been forward-leaning on our international cyber engagement. We've appointed key officials in cyber leadership roles and developed a comprehensive international cyber engagement strategy. And we encourage our international partners to also articulate their priorities for cyber. For Australia, I think I very much echo the comments of the past respondent. The application of existing international law in cyber must occur. Building norms of responsible state behaviour in cyber is critical. We also seek to coordinate capacity building in cybersecurity in partner nations, and to promote transparency in cyber capabilities. I'll end on transparency. It's a very important construct for us in Australia. In the last year, the Australian Signals Directorate head has made a number of public statements for the first time to take one of our most secret intelligence agencies and explain to the Australian community the nature of the capabilities and the mission they fulfil. And we'll continue to do that. And the final thought, without spending too much time on it, is that Australia, where appropriate, considers methods and means of attributing cyber attacks when they occur. And this is important for two reasons. For the purposes of transparency, to build resilience. One of the key challenges in building a strong cyber culture in the nation is to understand how cyber attacks occur and the damage they can do. And also to call out behaviours and international norms as we seek collectively to land on a safe, secure cyber domain, crucial to the way we will all engage in the digital age. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Min, I'd like to start with you. In your opening statements and even in some of your writings, you seem to be drawing a distinction that you think is important between what you would call kind of regular cybercrime and larger cyber national security related interests. So first part of that question is am I correct? Are you drawing that distinction? And then two, if such a distinction is warranted, how do we think about that distinction when it is projected that cybercrime could amount to as much as $6 trillion annually to the global economy, as well as it is often a mechanism that states will use to enrich themselves and to constrain other nations?
The reason I emphasize the distinction between cyber crimes and cyber security issues is that the too much resources and political attentions has been lopsided to the security issues, and for every country, for their domestic politics, more people should have their right to enjoy ordinary life very well, rather than their survival. So even in South Korea too, like America, the establishment of the cyber command or any other related institutions for the cyber securities have taken too much resources. And I think this will cause a lot of problems for many developing countries. So at the global level, we have to find out a fair paradigms for defining and regulating the cyberspace and cybersecurities. Yeah, that's one point.
Pavel, what do you think about that? The idea that dedicating the resources to cybersecurity and national security-related cyber issues is actually siphoning important resources away from other critical needs and the provision of services.
Many thanks for letting me step in immediately on the issue of cybercrime, because clearly when it comes to the economic effect, the results, devastating results of cybercrime are breathtaking, and the figures are only growing and growing. And of course, here you don't have any borderlines. This happens in a way that is extremely difficult to track and to prosecute. This is why it is absolutely essential that international community looks at cybercrime in the same way, based on the same rules. And I would like to underline the importance of so-called Budapest Convention, which is the only norm standard that should enable us, all countries, to work closely in order to fight cybercrime. There is sometimes a criticism coming that Budapest Convention was developed in Europe and does not apply universally. This is wrong. The origins of Budapest Convention are coming from the Council of Europe. That's true. But many countries from many different parts of the world have joined the Budapest Convention. There are around 70 countries at the moment. And having so many colleagues participating in this event, coming from many different parts of the world, including representatives from governments, having us being all on the same page when it comes to fighting cybercrime is absolutely essential. And the huge work that has been done with Budapest Convention is the best way forward.
Tomasz, you had something?
Yes. If I can just add an additional thought, I think it's a really important question, and it goes to the attribution point. Often, it's hard to tell at the time at which a cyber threat emanates where it comes from, which means I think we need to consider broadly, what we're dealing with. Obviously, if there is costs of crime, that's more obvious. But it's also generating, I think, very important national and international conversations about traditional roles and accountabilities in government. And in Australia, we have a very live debate about what is national policing and criminal responses and what are the national security functions. And on the spectrum without borders of threats in cyber, we will need to take a more mature approach as to where some of those traditional approaches have been, and make changes where that's appropriate to do so, respecting international law and so forth. So that's a conversation we should continue to have with partners, how we tackle an initial sense that there has been some sort of criminal event.
Tomasz?
Well, talking about combating cybercrime, I would try to put the issue on two pillars. First of them is, of course, what was previously mentioned, the international cooperation and the Budapest Convention, and of course building your national structures responsible for combating cyber crimes. For example, in Poland, previously to my actual position, I was Deputy Minister of Interior, responsible also for cooperation with national police and combating cybercrime. And we have decided in Poland to build within the national police the Cybercrime Combating Bureau, which is generally I do believe in building structures, stable structures that are responsible, what I mentioned in my opening remarks, for the issue that is designed especially for them, that is assigned for them. But the second pillar, not really less important, is awareness. Awareness of the threats coming from the cyberspace, and actually I also mean the responsibility, but the responsibility of the end user, responsibility and awareness. So we shouldn't do in cyberspace, we shouldn't do using our smartphones, our new technological items, the things that we won't ever do in physical world without cyberspace. So generally you don't share your credit card number with your friends. Generally you don't open everything that comes to you, and you do not know who sent it to you. Generally you have to be aware that it is not a very safe place, the global internet, and a lot of responsibility lies in your hands. So we have to start to educate on an early stage, because of course the youngsters, they are, I don't know, they were born with the smartphone in their hands, and it is like it is their world, not the world that we see now, and the world of the youngsters, of the young guys, of the young people, is the global internet, is the global network, and what comes with that. But in the times when it was only a place when you play games and chatted with your friends, are gone. They are simply gone. It is a place where you pay your bills, where you do most of your operations, and the digital transformations means also that there is more and more things that you cannot do without technology, without global network. But you have to be aware that it is not a safe place. Without that, any structure, any confidence building, any international cooperation, and any structure and any police won't help to deal with every threat that comes together with growing using of global network.
So I want to follow up with that, and I'd like to invite anyone on the panel who would like to respond to this question to do so. Virtually all of you mentioned the desirability and the need for global norms, international cooperation, and the like. I suspect that most of the people in this room would like a safer world, would like a more stable international environment, have no desire to see a world devolve into chaos, particularly the digital world. And yet, when we talk about these things, it often feels as though we're describing a world that we desire and not necessarily the world that we have. And so, to the degree that we are still lacking these international norms, why? Why don't we have these norms? Why don't we have these frameworks? Why don't we have these cooperative relationships? Rain?
If I may begin, I'd like to point out that we have many flags in this room. Smaller nations, larger nations, blocks of nations. But in terms of the cyberspace, we didn't invite the superpowers. I'm talking about the superpower that has
Google.
More citizens than India and China combined. Now, where's Facebook in this? Where's Google? Where are the ones that actually build this environment where perhaps the member of the board or perhaps the CEO on a whim can ruin the day of hundreds of millions of people or make the day of billions? If we look around here, states don't really build this environment. Yes, there's regulation, there's enforcement of some rules that states provide, but typically it's the private sector that builds things. The problems we are talking about, yes, there's cybercrime, and perhaps more resources need to be shifted towards dealing with it, but straight up cybercrime is not really a contentious issue. If you steal money in Korea, you can go to a different country and work with the law enforcement there. It's a matter of effectiveness and efficiency for sure. But in general, stealing is illegal everywhere. It is where national interests, politics, ideology come into play, where problems start, because then nations may not play with you, they may not cooperate with you, they may actively hinder you, and this is where this sort of international community needs to come together and make a few new rules, set some norms, and then try to abide by those norms. So one way to look at it is we have the potential culprits here. Right? We have the nations that perhaps will step outside these norms for their own national interest and then not work with others. But we don't have the builders here. And in order to move forward, perhaps at some future events, we may want to invite some builders as well. Pawel?
Yes, many thanks. And picking up from where my predecessor finished, clearly states do not build this environment. I fully agree. But it is up to the states to regulate this environment in cooperation with private sector, in cooperation with civil society, in cooperation with academia, but this is the responsibility of states. And here, going back to the words of our moderator, the key question is cyberspace something entirely new that requires new rules and new regulations that hasn't existed so far? Or is what we have developed over years, over decades, exactly applicable to cyberspace as it is offline? And our strong commitment is, our strong conviction is, and here there are a lot of like-minded countries saying that cyberspace is in no different way from any other offline reality. And all international law that has been developed over decades applies to cyberspace exactly in the same way as it applies in normal life. And this is the key division in the international community at the moment. We do not have a right to question the existing international law because of cyberspace. States and non-state actors should behave in cyberspace in exactly the same way as normal people behave offline. You cannot steal from someone in real life. It's a crime. And in the same way, you cannot steal in cyberspace. And an argument that the rules do not apply in cyberspace because cyberspace is new is a false argument. And this is why we have to stick together and to make sure that cyberspace, that the rules apply in cyberspace as they apply to any other sphere of life.
Tomasz?
There is no doubt that we have to cooperate, we have to build norms, build regulations, or maybe we don't have to, as Director Herczynski said. Maybe we just should apply the ones that exist and the ones that were created to the offline world. Maybe, but I would point one more thing from the perspective of Ministry of Defense, as we are all probably in this room in some ways representatives or ministries of national defense from our countries. So what is the main goal, the main task for every Ministry of Defense? Is to defend the country and defend the nation against any external threats, including now the cyberspace, which is the operational domain. So our task is to build build capabilities within our armed forces to combat the cyber attacks, to combat all the threats, all the hybrid threats that comes together with cyberspace. And with this perspective, I would give an example basing on the report prepared by the American Governmental Accountability Office in 2015. They claimed that in 2015 there were 77,000 cyber attacks on the networks supporting the American government, and including more than 1,000% more since 2006 of the attacks called a state-sponsored one. So we have to be aware that we are talking a lot about building confidence, we are talking a lot about building norms, about cooperation, but there is a lot of states, there is a lot of actors in our geopolitical environment. They simply don't care about the norms, they don't care about the rules, they act in cyberspace very offensively and aggressively. So besides the ongoing discussion all over the world on building confidence and building norms and ethical codes, moral aspects of using force in cyberspace, we have to be prepared and build capability to operate, to defend the country, defend the nation against the threats that are not coming in the future. They are now. They are present every day, day by day. Thank you.
Yeah, moderator, to the moderator's question about the difficulty of international cooperations, Mr. Ottis was talking about the gap between superpowers and ordinary countries. And I'd like to add one more thing to think about that difficulty, which is the different geographical difference between Europe and the West and the East Asian regions, which has been troubled by the Cold War legacies and the presence of the United States as an offshore hegemony. That has caused a lot difficulties, much more than European countries, European unions. And even in between the allied countries, like the United States, Japan, and South Korea, it has been so difficult to collaborate in sharing sensitive military informations. That's why South Korean government has decided a few days ago not to keep on their collaboration with sharing with Japan, sharing military information. So I think for the cyber security issues, we have to change our paradigms to overcome, to fill the gap between superpowers and ordinary powers and European or NATO system and the East Asian conflicting situations. I think the most important transformation of our paradigm starts from thinking cyberspace as a public good to be shared, public good resources to be shared for the whole Earth, I think.
So, Pawel, I think what you described in terms of the applicability of kind of legacy international law to the cyber domain, perhaps you're right, but that doesn't seem to be sufficiently broadly agreed to have produced the type of international cooperation that we all think is necessary and important. And one of the complicating factors that may be unique is something that has been hinted at, and that's the role of private companies. So let me frame that out. I'd like to investigate that a little bit more. Rain is absolutely right when he describes that the vast majority of information systems are designed in the private sector. They're implemented by the private sector. Facebook is, the third or maybe the sixth largest country in the world if it were a country. And I think that the development of these private sector entities and their capabilities has resulted in two related phenomenon that directly impact how national security leaders think about these questions. The first one is what I would call the state's loss of the monopoly of intelligence. In the same way that when terrorism reared its head, we said the state had lost its monopoly on violence, that now small sub-state groups were able to conduct violence that caused an international impact. These companies are in the business of intelligence. They want to produce, and then consume, and then investigate as much data as possible so that they can understand, predict, and even shape human behavior. Now, they call it marketing. Those of us from the government call that intelligence. And so that's an interesting development where we now have private sector entities that operate on a global scale that don't align themselves with a geographic country, but who assert increasingly the level of influence of governments. And the second related idea is the migration of the national security burden into the private sector. Precisely because they have these capabilities, states, in an effort to reassert their own sovereignty, are beginning to squeeze these companies and to bring them into compliance and to bring them into a place where they are going to have to make decisions about what services they provide and how they provide those services. In the case of the United States, I'll simply say that's why we've had the CEO of Facebook and Google before our Congress and asked them, why didn't you do more? Because there's now this growing expectation that they are active participants in this conversation. And so I'll leave it open for the panel. What role do you think the private sector should play in international and national cybersecurity? Cecilia.
I'll lead off. I think everything you say resonates, I'm sure, with all of us. And fundamentally, the digital revolution has had very little to do with governments. And not only that, but within government structures, even understanding the nature of what is possible in the digital revolution, something to do with our age and demographics, I'm sure, has been, I think, a harder question to come to. Fundamentally, the future of cyberspace has to go beyond governments and borders, because it already is. And the large companies who are shaping the world that we will live in must be part of that conversation. But they don't come to conferences like this, and they're not in the United Nations, and they're not in the EU, where we have conversations about norms. I think it would be hard to find many countries who would actually disagree with the positions Pawel and I would take on the need to assert international law. But of course, the cyber domain is new. It's not well understood by those outside the tech world or the kids born with a smartphone in their hand. And the fundamental challenge for us in the national security communities is to understand how to even have that conversation. And what about the ways in which, really, since the end of World War II, we've used as the ways to resolve international norms. But that's the conversation we have to have. And we've had some success in recent times. I think Facebook, following Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in the Congress, has sought to make changes. There's been a number of steps forward after the horrific attack in New Zealand to have tech companies work more actively with security forces. And in Australia, we will continue to push on those doors and work with the tech companies to help us in particularly global cyber. But for us, it's building that sense of resilience and knowledge and a smart cyber country, because without that, we don't even know what questions we're asking. And I think as any new domain emerges, and space would be the other wonderful conversation to have in a forum like this, it's not surprising that people will be adventurous and bold, particularly when it's harder for us to understand the nature of how threats play out.
Please.
Yeah. For the roles of private sectors in cybersecurity, as the moderator said, I think I agree with him to his point that the state is losing its power and its authority in this field. So I think this is the beginning of the decline of the modern or traditional sovereignty system that has defined a modern international system upon the Westphalian Treaty of more than 400 years ago. But if we allow more roles, more authority of the private sectors, then we will face another problems. That is the principle of democracy. And for the democracy to work on, to represent our opinions, ordinary peoples, then private sectors had to guarantee two principles. One is the accountability, the other is legitimacy. I'm not sure whether private sectors have fulfilled well, either or both of the principles. So that's why we have to think about the possibility of regulation mechanisms domestically as well as internationally. And until now, in terms of international cooperation in the cybersecurity sectors, I am quite pessimistic. As I told you previously, East Asian region has been so pessimistic in expecting any international cooperation for sharing sensitive military informations or cybersecurity issues. So that's why I want to listen to the European countries' experience over the Tallinn manuals or GGE dialogues, whatever else.
Yes, many thanks. I don't think anyone is denying the huge and even growing role of private sector in cyberspace. And clearly, as I said before, private sector should be part of the conversation. At the same time, we should not forget about the responsibilities of governments. Private sector is driven by business interests. Governments have responsibility to protect our countries and our citizens. And this is why what my Australian colleague said, attribution of malicious cyber activities is absolutely essential. It's also very difficult. And it's especially difficult for international organizations like European Union, where we have 28 member states. And attribution is a sovereign decision of every and each member state. However, it is essential to name and shame those who are standing behind malicious cyber activities. And I also agree with the Polish defense minister that we need to respond, we need to be prepared. And I think from part of the European Union it was absolutely revolutionary to decide on the establishment of the autonomous cyber sanctions regime. So now the European Union is in the position to respond to a cyber attack, to a malicious cyber activity by imposing sanctions. This is unbelievable. But clearly, as we say, rules that apply offline should apply also online. If you are a bad guy, if you are doing damage, you have to be aware that there will be consequences. And clearly, such things cannot be left to the private sector.
So let me just follow up on that, because one of the complicating factors in this discussion is that recognizing that these new technologies are necessary for effective statecraft going forward. Some nations have deliberately fused their civilian and national security sectors, oftentimes using private companies as extensions of their military and intelligence agencies. What distortions does this cause? How do you, in international law, how do you, as a nation, recognize this reality and effectively respond to it. Celia, if you want to start.
We're dealing with this very debate in Australia right now, and I think that's a really important point. Two things. I want to pick up a point that Pawel just made also. For us, the path to considering that is within legal frameworks. So we're working through a very detailed process right now of reviewing our intelligence legislation so that the legislation that supports the activities of our intelligence apparatus, foreign and domestic, addresses these challenges into the future. None of the ways we operate were designed to deal with the way that we work now in cyber. And a core part of that is to address and consider that traditional boundary between offshore roles and onshore roles, as we would say in Australia, or what domestic agencies do versus those outside. We haven't landed on the answer yet because it is an incredibly difficult conversation to have within a country. It's difficult for us because I think in the way we live and think about our democracy, those roles are separate and different, and we care very much for the democratic rights and freedoms of our citizenry. And civil policing agencies and domestic agencies with the ability to operate in cyber, understanding there are no boundaries is a very difficult conversation to have. Part of the way we will deal with that is through legal frameworks, clear accountabilities and limitations. So for us in Australia, a core part of that conversation is the role of courts and warrants in the ways in which people can act to undertake investigations, for instance, online. And that's a conversation we'll keep having. I wanted to just touch very briefly on the point about defences. I think it's not just, the environment is challenging, it's difficult to understand, it's hard to understand how people act, although we can see the effects of it. So one of the really central things is, I think, to work at a baseline that much as using the crime analogy we have, we accept that crime exists and therefore we protect and insure against it. We lock our houses, we don't leave valuables around. And I think in government and in the community, that needs to be the approach moving forward to cyber, to assume. Until recently, I was the Department of Defence's Chief Security Officer, and we know that our systems are under near constant attack in the tens of thousands of incidents monthly. Therefore, we must assume wherever the vector is that the cybersphere will be used for attack, and we must defend against it. So it's really turning the conversation the other way around to build that resilience from the inside out.
I would maybe get back a little bit to the main question of the general idea of the involvement of the private sector, private companies in the cybersecurity environment. And I guess that the primary question is what kinds of companies do we have on the table in that sphere. There's a number of them for sure, but also for sure three kinds. First of them is, of course, are of course global corporations, especially the ones that delivers social networks. Then, for example, critical infrastructure operators and the companies involved in the supply chains for the government, for the military, for the administration. So, starting from the first step, the global ones, the global players, I guess it is clearly a challenge for international community, as it was very well pointed out. They might be compared to the largest states, or even greater. Of course, for example, in Poland, about 60% of population uses Facebook in many kinds of a way, and 85% uses Google. And we could count more in every country. So it is a challenge for international community to create rules, to, of course, have them by the table and to talk, to have a discussion, but finally to create international rules and obligations that then will have to be obeyed. Then the second thing, critical infrastructure, crucial for every country, for the crisis management, for internal security, and very attractive for all the ones who wants to prepare hostile, who wants to act hostile in cyberspace, because of course we talk all the time about cyber threats, cyberspace, cybersecurity as the new challenge. It is not new because the first cyber attacks, so-called, on critical infrastructure was dated in mid-1990s, but that's why it is so important for every nation, and I guess it is a nation's role, the government role, to create rules, national rules and obligations that will have to be obeyed, and will guarantee that the company that operates key critical infrastructure entities will be safe for us all. And then the last but not least, of course, the safe supply chain. It is discussed all over the world, especially according to implementation of 5G technology. Of course, the best way is to have your own capability. It is the best way. It is not always possible to have all produced and developed by yourself, but then the next step is to cooperate with mind-like countries, with the allies. Then again, to be safe, to be sure that everything that you buy consists only the things that you paid for and nothing more, actually.
So, Rain, I know you want as you make your comment, I wonder after that if you would address, so you specialize in using exercises to help governments be responsive in this environment. But a part of what we're describing is frankly a lack of agility within governments to do this. So I wonder if you could share, after you make your other comments, some of the key takeaways that you've learned through these exercises, things that practitioners here in the room would appreciate knowing as they try to develop that capability going forward.
Right, thank you. So a couple of quick points first. Number one, I was fortunate enough to be on the team that created the first Tallinn manual. And I fully agree that there's plenty of rules out there that should prevent most of these problems if we only follow them. So that's one. How do we get more people, more countries, more actors to follow the rules that exist? And if we look at the UN, UN didn't just magically appear. UN, according to my understanding, is a major result of World War II in the hopes of perhaps avoiding World War III, or at least managing the violence on a daily basis. Now, in the UN Charter, which was also mentioned this morning, there are some things there that, again, should prevent armed conflict, because use of force is deemed illegal, and I think all of the countries that are present here today have signed on to this. We're not going to use force to settle our disputes. There's two exceptions to the rule. You can use it in self-defense, but that means somebody has already broken the rule. Or you can use force when the UN deems it okay. So I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So two very simple rules. And if everybody would play by them, we would have no need for a military conflict debate or a peace-themed conference, perhaps. Now, the private sector, in terms of cyberspace, is trying to self-regulate right now, because there have been multiple cases where their behavior has been less than honorable, perhaps, or is viewed in a negative light. It has become public. There's been an outcry, and that's how humans learn, right? We make mistakes, and then hopefully we learn from our own mistakes. We haven't really evolved to the state where we regularly learn from other people's mistakes. So let's just have the basic assumptions that mistakes will be made and have been made. And now the question is, how can we move from the mistake to something that makes it a bit better, right? Whether it's a new charter, some sort of a self-regulation commitment that private sector companies can take. Primarily, we need to push for a larger culture change, and it has to be a united front effort from the end user, end consumer perspective, supported by governments. So the users should demand from the companies for some basic things. If I have my phone in my bedroom, I should have the assumption that employees of Apple are not listening, to what we are doing in my bedroom. I should also have the assumption that some government cannot order the company to relinquish this information for intelligence purposes. So currently we don't have these assumptions, or at least it's not an educated guess to make those assumptions. And we need to push for that, to have a more transparent system where the companies are more responsible, to have also a government side commitment not to abuse these companies, because otherwise we are entering into a very, very dystopian environment where we will have billions, tens of billions, eventually hundreds of billions of devices all around us, inside us as well. And we don't know what these devices do, who controls them, what added functionality there may be. So I don't think we want to go there, but we are steadily moving in that direction. So a concerted push by the population, supported by government and international as well. As to your question on the lack of agility and what we see, I would say it is the willingness to play. It is the willingness to look in the face of your own mistakes that sets some countries apart. Because let's be honest, none of us are perfect, as is the case with the UN Charter. We all have our own quirks, our own limitations. But as long as we are aware of them, we probably can set up some mitigating measures and hopefully it will not be as bad on the day when this issue comes to the table. So yes, there are many sort of individual examples that are quite recurring. This wish to control everything, to have full control of the situation, of the information, which is just not realistic, because again, much of the information you may need is not going to be in your jurisdiction. It may not be easily accessible to government. Even if you do get it, it may not be apparent what you have. It may take months or years to analyze the data that is collected. So if you just look at it from a very centralized, very hierarchical point of view, then you are kind of setting yourself up for failure. And failure, not in the exercise sense, but failure in dealing with the actual problems that you have. So yeah, play around, experiment, and make mistakes, because these are your mistakes. Hopefully you can learn from them.
So I'd like to do a quick poll of the panel. And so I'd like you to raise your hand if you think that it is likely that there will be a large-scale cyber attack against a nation that results in significant loss of human life within the next 20 years.
So,
okay? Within the next 10 years. Within the next 5 years. Huh. Okay, so we're optimistic in the short term. We're frightened in the long term. Why? Why are you optimistic? Anyone, Why are you optimistic in the near term, but skeptical in the long term? Please.
Because it is strongly connected with the digital transformation ongoing, and more and more digital spheres in every country means that there is a lot of new possibilities that could create devastating cyber attacks. So it comes together with the possibility. I guess that in upcoming years, as I mentioned previously, for example, the automotive cars and the concept of Internet of Things, the 5G network, and when it will grow, it will be everything that has a smart, that is called as a smart, means it is potentially frightening, and it might be a threat coming from cyberspace.
So if I understand that, and anybody's welcome to kind of unpack this, the threat surface is just going to grow so large eventually that both the barriers to attacking that threat surface and the implications of attacking that threat surface are just going to exceed our ability to protect. Is that correct? Brains?
So I didn't take part in the sort of numbers game, the countdown, because I think historically we have always been wrong on these countdowns. So my view is that yes, it is likely that we're going to have an incident which is going to have human casualties. It is probably going to be an accident, as in, things will get out of control. So it may be an attack to begin with, but with second, third order effects getting actually worse than expected. And yes, it is because dependency increases. We will have more and more devices. We will relinquish more and more control to these devices. So we're not just talking about a smart fridge or a smart car. We are also going to talk about medical implants that are within us, things like this. And every year we will have more and more of these. At the same time, capabilities to attack also increase. So yes, if it is happening, I don't expect it to be like a willing, conscious plan that we are going to cause hundreds, thousands of deaths. It's more likely going to be an accident or accidental result of something that is much bigger. And I also don't expect that this would be a cyber-only event. I can definitely see this as part of some larger conflict that will have your more traditional arms of the military involved, other pillars of power, and then cyber might be just one part of that.
So I think one of the key takeaways perhaps for the participants and the observers of this conversation is to go back and spend time speaking with your own governments about how you can minimize the likelihood of an unnecessary escalation in the wake of a cyber event. It may very well be the case that the intended action is not what actually happened, and that our own responses and our own ability to both understand and to ultimately respond to that is going to be, frankly, far more influential than the original attack in terms of how things progress afterwards. I think we're running out of time, and so I would like to thank the panel for an excellent conversation. You were all wonderful, very insightful, and I hope that you would join me in thanking them once again for their time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's quite a far distance. So thank you very much for your active discussion. We need another big round of applause to the panelists and the moderator. Thank you. So everyone, now we'll have a short break, but after getting some fresh air at the short break, we'll have the official closing ceremony. We need your great participation. Please join us in the official ceremony. Official closing ceremony will begin at 12:30. And also do not miss the security tour. So please get around on the first floor to JSA.